In lieu of doing some snarky introduction, in this video we're going to touch on the recent Peterson news. Peterson has most recently sought treatment in Russia for coming off the medication he had been on, and was the focus of the last major Peterson news. The primary source of information has been his daughter on Peterson's YouTube channel. I've seen a bit about Peterson possibly sustaining permanent neurological damage, although his daughter's statement makes it sound like he's on a rapid mend, so I'm not really sure what's going on here. I just wanted to say again on a Peterson video that I may disagree strongly with him on a number of topics, but he's still a person. Withdrawing from this type of medication is not a joke. I don't understand why he's made the choices he has, but it's his body and his life. He's on the receiving end of a lot of hate. As a woman and as an atheist, some of the things he's written and said infuriate me. I'm not gonna lie. But I wouldn't wish permanent neurological damage on anybody. For the sake of one living being to another, may he have a healthy recovery and get the time and space he needs to get sorted. We are going to continue with the 12 rules until we're done. You guys have been great in the comment section so far, so I probably don't need to worry, but let's make sure it stays civil. This video made possible by the continuing support of viewers and patrons like you. Welcome back to the channel. In this video, we are pressing on with this cognitive psychologist's take on Jordan B. Peterson's 12 Rules for Life in Antidote to Chaos. We are now up to Rule 8, tell the truth, or at least don't lie. The short of it seems like Pinocchio and his nose growth issue have been spun up into a life directive. We'll get through the first half of this rule in this video, which includes a bit of autobiography from Lobster Daddy himself. Brief refresher for the Peterson video format. This is for what's in the book, and this is for my responses and reactions to what's been written by Peterson. Finally, YouTuber word diarrhea. Like, comment, subscribe. You can also find me on Twitter, Discord, which recently just got a little bit of a revamp from me, and also Patreon. If you become a patron, you get access to behind-the-scenes footage, blooper reels, cat videos, the ability to vote on upcoming topics like last week's horizontal and vertical cats, access to the monthly live stream, and more as I figure out what you guys want. Alright, so let's find out why Peterson says we should never ever lie. For never ever. Peterson did his doctoral work at McGill University, which is in Montreal, Canada. McGill is one of the top Canadian universities, in case you aren't up to date on those. He and his fellow students would sometimes go to the Douglas Hospital, which was nearby, and house the Psych ward. He does mention the deinstitutionalization movement that I covered in my psychiatry video.
The hospital once sheltered hundreds of long-term in-house patients. This was before antipsychotic drugs and the large-scale deinstitutionalization movements of the late 60s all but closed down the residential asylums, most often dooming the now freed patients to a much harder life on the streets. By the early 80s, when I first visited the grounds, all but the most seriously afflicted residents had been discharged. Those who remained were strange, much damaged people. They clustered around the vending machines scattered throughout the hospital's tunnels.
Two comments here. First, if I found out that my mental health professional viewed their clients as much damaged or strange, I would be out there finding a new one as soon as I could, or quitting if there were no alternatives available. Basically, that's a huge red flag for me at this point. Second, you may recall throughout the videos talking about the DSM and psychiatry that I kept coming back to the Rosenhan experiment on being sane in insane places. Briefly, this experiment involved trying to get average, run-of-the-mill, no psychiatric condition people committed into psychiatric wards or asylums. They showed up, said they were hearing the words hollow, empty, and thud over and over in their head. All were admitted, and most were given a schizophrenia diagnosis. Part of the waves made by this paper were the inside experiences reported. To keep this short, the patients weren't really treated as people, and normal behaviors would be explained by staff through the lens of the person's diagnosis. I bring that paper up now because it seems like, unfortunately, Peterson is kind of echoing that detached observation. These strange people hung around the vending machine, and that's one of the only descriptors we get for these patients. Maybe they were there because there's nothing better to do. Maybe they were there because they're bored of hospital food. Maybe they just happen to be there every time the students show up because sometimes a student would buy them something from it. A fellow classmate of Peterson's, who he describes as a sheltered conservative young woman, was approached by one of the patients, asked what they were doing, if she could come along, and Peterson says that this woman asked him what she should say. Maybe this is how it went down, maybe some details have been changed to make this a better story, but either way, of course, Peterson is the one being deferred to by his lady colleague. He describes the uncertainty he says the students felt in the situation as they weren't prepared for how to deal with somebody so isolated and hurt. He came to two possibilities. 1, tell this patient a story, or 2, tell her the truth.
We can only take 8 people in our group would have fallen into the first category, as would have, we are just leaving the hospital now. Neither of these answers would have bruised any feelings, at least on the surface, and the presence of the status differences that divided us from her would have gone unremarked. But neither answer would have been precisely true, so I didn't offer either.
I don't understand how he thinks that telling the patients that they were just leaving wouldn't also illustrate the status difference between the students and the patients. It's not like the patients can just leave at any time like the students can. It's also strange to me that he seems to think, given what's written here and later, that this woman wasn't keenly aware that this group of students weren't patients at the very least. They're young, kind of on edge probably, being led around by the doctor in charge of training students and given directions by them. It's probably pretty easy to tell that they're not patients. Now, if this woman was schizophrenic, like Peterson says she was, she may have had some disconnection from reality. But to assume that her asking to come along was a symptom of the schizophrenia and not just her desperate for something new to do. Peterson, in true Peterson form, tells this patient that they're students and she can't come with. And he says that this makes the divide between the students and the patients more apparent, and this was probably harsher than lying to her.
But I already had an inkling that untruth, however well meant, can produce unintended consequences.
He says that she looked hurt by this, but that she got over it. Something that isn't clear to me is how this information was conveyed. There is a world of difference between we're students and you can't come, and sorry, we're students and you can't come. Also, that he sees these as discrete options is terribly on brand for him. Harsh truth or comforting lie, order or chaos. But the truth doesn't have to be harsh, especially for something like this. Finally, I hope that Peterson never works with dementia, Alzheimer's, or other memory-impaired populations. For example, let's say you have a patient who long-term memory is good, so they remember their spouse, they remember their kids on a good day, long-term autobiographical stuff is intact. But the newer information, not so much. So let's say their spouse is dead. They're not coming back. The old way of doing things was to be honest with them, be upfront. It was thought to be ethical and the moral thing to do, to respect their autonomy as an adult. And what ended up happening is you have this person who doesn't remember that their spouse is dead, is wondering where they are, and the staff would tell this person, I'm sorry, but your spouse is dead. They've been dead for however many years. And so this person now has to go through the grieving process every time this comes up. My understanding of the new model of care is it's okay to lie to them. They don't need to go through this mourning every single time they think of their spouse. Instead, they're out running an errand, getting some food, they're walking the dog, they're doing something, but they'll be by later. Don't worry. And that way, you don't put them through this grieving process every time. And really, that seems like the more humane option. There's a Maps of Meaning reference in the context of where Peterson was at mentally before going to grad school.
I found myself subject to some rather violent compulsions, none acted upon, and developed the conviction, in consequence, that I really knew rather little about who I was and what I was up to.
Okay. This, plus his description of his old friend group, really paints quite the picture of Peterson. Because he didn't really know himself, he decided to figure himself out. And he found that he had two parts. The speaking part, and then another part that didn't speak, was attentive and judgy.
I soon came to realize that almost everything I said was untrue. I had motives for saying these things. I wanted to win arguments and gain status and impress people and get what I wanted. But I was a fake.
Has this really changed, though? After realizing what he was saying and doing, he decided to only say things that his inner, attentive, judgy self wouldn't have a problem with. And this resulted in him not lying when he talked. So, because Peterson can't produce subtlety in his language, it's truth or nothing. For everyone. This loops back to the stuff earlier in the book about the two fundamental cognitive categories being male and female according to Peterson. Following this emphasis on only telling the truth, I guess for his internal logic to hang together, he'd have to address people according to his perception of their fundamental category membership? I may have sprained my brain a little bit there. Later on, Peterson says that he had a paranoid and dangerous client.
Working with paranoid people is challenging. They believe they have been targeted by mysterious conspiratorial forces, working malevolently behind the scenes. Paranoid people are hyper-alert and hyper-focused. They are attending to nonverbal cues with an intentness never manifest during ordinary human interactions. They make mistakes in interpretation, that's the paranoia, but they are still almost uncanny in their ability to detect mixed motives, judgment, and falsehood. You have to listen very carefully and tell the truth if you're going to get a paranoid person to open up to you.
To reemphasize, my background is not in clinical or counseling, so besides a few students who talk to me about minor conspiratorial things, I don't have experience dealing with somebody with paranoia. From what I can find, it seems like people with paranoid schizophrenia can respond to treatment and get back out into society, but getting them cured of the paranoia is unlikely. Things like medication or desensitization to the triggering things can help, but backslides into clinical levels of paranoia are likely. This client would describe violent revenge fantasies, and Peterson describes how he was careful in his reaction to these stories. He also says that he would attend to what he was thinking and feeling, then would share this with the patient.
I told him when he scared me, often, that his words and behavior were misguided and that he was going to get into serious trouble.
Something that came to mind for me here is this type of feedback probably isn't unique to Peterson. This approach is probably taught in some clinical and counseling approaches. Hearing how your actions, thoughts, and behaviors impact a relatively unbiased observer is probably helpful in figuring out that those behaviors are disordered.
He talked to me nonetheless because I listened and responded honestly, even though I was not encouraging in my responses. He trusted me despite, or more accurately, because of my objections. He was paranoid, not stupid.
I'd be curious to know more about this guy. Was he inpatient, outpatient, voluntarily in there, involuntarily in there? Did he pick Peterson as his mental health professional, or was he assigned him? We're given a little info about this client from Peterson. He describes the type of situation that would end poorly for this guy. Basically, dealing with bureaucratic bullshit and a petty tyrant, with the client believing that the obstructions to what he was trying to do were against his honor. This client, when his honor was besmirched, would stalk, or worse, although the extent of how much worse is unclear, the person who did it.
He was no one to lie to. I told him the truth, and that cooled him off.
But isn't it possible that some of these people who inadvertently shat on this guy's honor were just following the rules? Like, I totally get, I've been there, that it's super frustrating when you're trying to get something done and you're missing one little piece of paperwork out of the entire stack that you brought. I get it. But there's rules. They can't proceed further unless you have everything you need. Granted, they can be kind of sympathetic or a prick, but in either case, you're not getting the thing done that you're trying to do. If these people were following the protocols or rules, how were they lying to this client? They were being truthful about him not having everything he needed and ended up with a very angry guy as a result. Is it necessarily the case that Peterson telling him the truth was making everything hunky-dory, or that he wasn't inadvertently pushing this guy's buttons? And again, if this client is inpatient involuntarily, possibly as a jail alternative, he wouldn't exactly have the opportunity to go out and stalk Peterson like these other people. If he wasn't in that situation, maybe it would have ended differently. But who knows?
I had a landlord around that time who had been president of a local biker gang. My wife, Tammy, and I lived next door to him in his parents' small apartment building. His girlfriend bore the marks of self-inflicted injuries characteristic of borderline personality disorder. She killed herself while we lived there.
Jesus Christ, Peterson, that escalated. I just want to talk about something that came up in the DSM and psychiatry videos. It's only relatively recently that self-harm has been pulled out from the borderline personality disorder diagnosis. Maybe this woman did have the BPDs. Maybe she had something else. Peterson is keeping an old school DSM with this kinda tactless comment. This is the only discussion of this woman. It's gross that shit this woman is dealing with is used as adding to a negative descriptor of their landlord. However, unfortunately, this is totally consistent with the rest of this section. Their landlord, Denis, is described as, let's say, problematically troubled. He was a DIY electrician, a bit of an artist, and French Canadian. He was also struggling with sobriety post-incarceration. Struggling and losing. Peterson mentions his doctoral work on risks for alcoholism and how alcoholics can drink. Their landlord had a dog who would sometimes howl at the moon with the landlord in the middle of the night. Peterson says that this would happen when the landlord would be on a bank-breaking bender, and then he'd show up at Peterson's apartment. The landlord would try to sell Peterson various things, and sometimes he'd buy them. But after a certain point, Tammy had enough, put her foot down, said, "No more, you're enabling his alcoholism," and Peterson says that this put him in a tricky position.
What do you say to a severely intoxicated, violence-prone ex-biker gang president with patchy English when he tries to sell his microwave to you at your open door at 2 a.m? This was a question even more difficult than those presented by the institutionalized patient or the paranoid flayer. But the answer was the same, the truth. But you'd bloody well better know what the truth is.
We're going to finish this story before getting to what I think the lesson is here. The landlord then showed up and tried to hawk his toaster to Peterson.
I rid myself to the bottom of my soul of primate dominance motivations and moral superiority.
Okay, I'm gonna let him finish, but is he sure about that?
In that moment, I wasn't an educated, anglophone, fortunate, upwardly mobile young man. He wasn't an ex-con Quebecois biker with a blood alcohol level of 0.24. No, we were two men of goodwill trying to help each other out in our common struggle to do the right thing. I said that he had told me he was trying to quit drinking. I said that I would not be good for him if I provided him with more money. I said that he made Tammy, whom he respected, nervous when he came over so drunk and so late and tried to sell me things.
Peterson says that the landlord stared at him for a little bit, looking for any physical tell that Peterson had been lying, but he had spoken the truth, so it was fine.
Denis turned and left. Not only that, he remembered our conversation, despite his state of professional level intoxication. He didn't try to sell me anything again. Our relationship, which was quite good, given the great cultural gaps between us, became even more solid. Taking the easy way out or telling the truth, those are not merely two different choices. They are different pathways through life. They are utterly different ways of existing.
Alright, let's start with the details and then work our way back out to the forest. For one thing, I would be interested in knowing a non-Peterson version of this landlord's story. Granted, most of the landlords I've had, I've only known superficial details about them at most. But it seems like there's a lot happening here for this landlord that isn't being told. But it's entirely possible that Peterson just doesn't know. Also, bluntly, when did the girlfriend kill herself? Did the landlord's alcoholism kick back up after this happened? Was it unrelated? If it was unrelated, why bring up the girlfriend at all? The detail that's missing here is that just because this guy stopped trying to sell stuff to Peterson doesn't mean that he stopped selling stuff altogether or was cured of his addiction. It just means that he figured out that Peterson wasn't a buyer anymore, and he had to go elsewhere. Having more information about how their relationship became better after this talk would be incredibly helpful. Right now, the only improvement Peterson has included is that his landlord wasn't selling him random shit anymore. And yeah, that would be an improvement to a relationship, but is that it? Or is there backyard BBQs and bullshit sessions he's neglecting to mention? Basically, note that there is no discussion of the landlord's relationship to alcohol improving or him getting into a treatment program of some form. The landlord was just not selling random shit to Peterson anymore. If anyone is surprised by the absolutist division between
taking the easy way out
or
telling the truth,
I'd suggest you go back over the previous Peterson videos because that's how Peterson breaks everything down, box A or B. There is no space in this worldview for the situations when the alternative to telling the truth isn't the easy way out. How many people worldwide are forced into living a lie because if they stop taking the easy way out and told the truth, they might well end up dead? LGBTQ, atheists, other group of people who believe the wrong thing or are from the wrong group but pass as the majority? Would Peterson tell them to stop lying and tell the truth? Actually, given how the last rules went, he probably would. Fuck. At a broader level, in my view, this shouldn't be conceptualized as lie versus truth, but as establishing and maintaining boundaries. So standard cast disclaimer here. At this point, we're talking about things that are just from my experience, as well as my friend Lily's research into this type of stuff. So no training in this whatsoever, just life experience, one person to another. Okay, boundaries in this context are the lines you set up that you don't want crossed. These can be emotional, physical, or other aspects where your wishes need to be respected by others. Some examples may be how you are spoken to, how you want to be touched, or the division between your work and home life. The important part with boundaries is to establish for yourself and others what they are. This can be done overtly by saying something like, "I will not be spoken to in this manner," or more covertly, like backing away from somebody who's entering your physical space. After you've established the boundary, you need to enforce it. So let's say you set up a boundary that you won't be spoken down to or yelled at by someone else. If it happens again, remind this person that you've got this boundary. You won't be spoken down to or yelled at. You have to reinforce it. This can be incredibly awkward. My husband had an exchange with one of his colleagues at one point that was very heated. The colleague was very worked up, yelling at my husband, cursing at my husband. My husband flat out, "I will not be spoken to in this way," and hung up on him. Fortunately, the colleague called back and apologized. Said, this other guy got me worked up, it was out of place, whatever. So it worked out. Hopefully, with enough time and consistent reinforcement of those boundaries, the people you interact with will know your boundaries and respect them, and that will make your interactions in day-to-day life go smoother. An example of this from my life of it going well before we get to it going not well. So as a grad student and an adjunct, sometimes I would have students who wanted to start a friendship with me mid-semester. And so I told them, look, I'm sorry, I've got a professional boundary here. I don't want to be accused of favoritism or other misconduct with a student, so until the end of the semester, just keep it on the back burner. And the students respected that. And I actually made some interesting friends at the end of the semester when I was able to do this. The tricky thing here is not everybody's going to respect your boundaries. Even if you are absolutely consistent in reinforcing your boundaries, some people are just going to walk right over them. Examples. In grad school, with my advisor, at the end, I set boundaries for what I thought was acceptable behavior for how he was giving feedback and treating students, especially because that's how he's treating the male students of the lab. His response was to call me discordant and be more difficult moving forward. Lily, in her experience with her ex-husband, started to enforce boundaries for all kinds of things, from personal hygiene standards of her ex to how she would be touched or talked to. The ex regularly tested or ignored those boundaries up until she left that situation. The important things with these examples is that these people were unwilling to respect professional or personal boundaries. Unfortunately, that's just how some people are. So what do you do then? If you try to establish boundaries and have done the sometimes uncomfortable steps to enforce them, but someone is still blowing past them, it may be time to reduce that person's involvement in your life. This is a difficult thing to do, personally or professionally. But that person who is disrespecting you is not likely to change at this point. If you've given them a chance to honor or at least have a chat with you about your boundaries, and they are instead just walking over them, they aren't interested in respecting your wishes. Do not feel like it is your responsibility to change them. Granted, this is a little more complicated when we're talking about your children potentially, but adult to adult, it is not your job or responsibility to change anybody. This was absolutely a difficult step in Lily's experience with her ex. After she had well beyond hit her bullshit threshold with him, she said she wanted a divorce. He said he wanted a chance to change his ways. She was willing to give him that chance. Around 10 years of awfulness, but she still believed he could be the guy that she thought he was. He changed, sorta, briefly. But then he flipped into victim mode and started up the mind games again, so it was time to get out. In professional settings, like if your boss is a twat, this removal process can be difficult. If you can, see if you can change managers, teams, however your organization is organized. And we're back at the issue of honesty. Unless you absolutely 100% trust the person you're talking to and that they won't spill the beans on why you want to switch, you have to be really careful with what information you do provide. It may be a bad idea to be completely upfront and honest about why you want to switch managers or bosses or whatever, because in my experience, people who are willing to just ignore boundaries are also vindictive. Try to find explanations that make sense, something that doesn't necessarily implicate the person you're trying to get away from. I saw this work for a couple grad students when I was in grad school, where they were able to get out from under the horrible advisor without burning that bridge. If you can excise this person from your life entirely, this process can kind of be easier. There may be questions from mutual people who know both you and the person who just ignores boundaries, and there may be some fallout where a person feels like they have to pick one or the other, and you might lose some friends in this. The thing to not lose sight of if you have to go through this process is that you are doing this because you are a person just like everybody else, and you are entitled to personal dignity. Something else to keep in mind is you need to know which of your boundaries are non-negotiable and which have some wiggle room. You may find yourself with a more adventurous sexual partner. What sorts of things are absolute no-goes for you and your partner, and which are things you're willing to try with the understanding you can revoke consent if it's not right for you. These are sometimes awkward, but absolutely necessary talks that should be had before being in the middle of things, especially in this context. Another thing is that sometimes you can discover that you've got a boundary because somebody just crossed it and now you're not feeling so good. For non-criminal things, it can be helpful to have a talk with the person who crossed this boundary about, hey, so that thing you did, I'm not feeling too good about it, and it would really be helpful for me if you wouldn't do that again in the future, and, maybe have a little dialogue. Personal example. I used to playfully mock my husband by repeating back what he said at me with a different tone of voice. So, an example, unfortunately, is cooking, holding tongs with boiling water. You're gonna burn yourself, and so I would, you're gonna burn yourself. And then I'd burn myself, but that's beside the point. At some point, it came up that this was actually hurting his feelings because that's what some bullies would do to him, that dropping the voice and doing the tone. So I stopped doing that, and I still kind of can sometimes poke him a little bit for that, but not in that specific way. We've worked out that if I do a goofy sort of voice, it's fine, and certain topics are off limits, but for the most part, it's okay. Because we had a chat and we had a dialogue, and I respect his boundaries there. Bringing this back to this section, it sounds like Peterson set a boundary with his landlord, and his landlord respected that boundary. There is an element of truth in this, in that in order to communicate your boundaries effectively, you have to honestly know what's going to work for you. But as I mentioned, setting up a boundary doesn't always work with everybody. Some people will just blow right past them, and it's not because you weren't being truthful enough. So that's where we're going to leave this video. The remaining sections are called Manipulate the World and The Truth Instead. And let's see, there's talk of epigenetics, sacrifice, betraying yourself, a dash of Solzhenitsyn, a whole ton of Milton, courageous aim and ambition, and of course, the suffering of life. So, until next time, bye!